Well, kia ora whānau. So good to be connecting together on this special day. In a biography of the late Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, the biography recalls a scene near the end of Steve Jobs' life. Apparently, he was sitting in a garden, not feeling so well, and he was reflecting on the reality of his imminent death. And he said, "For most of my life, I felt that there must be more to our existence that meets the eye. I like to think that something survives after you die. You know, it's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures." And then he was silent for some time, and then he said, "But on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch, click, and you're gone." And he smiled and said, "Maybe that's why I never liked to put on-off switches on Apple devices." You see, Steve Jobs wrestled with a question that many people wrestle with. Is there some kind of life beyond this life? Some kind of existence beyond this existence? See, many people want to believe that something survives. We want to believe that there's something more than just this life, than just living and working and dying. But a lot of people are just, well, they're not sure of what that is, what that something is. And our fear is that death is the end. After that, well, nada, nothing, full stop, end of the story. And it might surprise you to know that Easter Sunday began in a gloomy and grim way. Everybody thought the events of Good Friday when Jesus was crucified was the end of the story. And so as Sunday came around, there were no Christians because there was no Christ. It was lights out on everyone's faith. There was a broken-hearted mother. There were disillusioned Galilean fishermen who thought they had wasted a season of their life, but there were certainly no Jesus followers because in their minds, there was no Jesus anymore. So see, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the authors of the New Testament Gospels, are very clear. No one was planning to keep this dream alive. No one was planning to keep this movement moving. And here's why. If Jesus couldn't keep himself alive, what's the point of trying to keep the Jesus movement alive? Because clearly Jesus can't be who he claimed to be. You see, in their minds, Good Friday was the end of the story. It's this massive and bleak full stop. One of my favorite stories occurs right here at the end of Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 24. And I love the way Luke tells the story about Easter through this encounter of two people who actually met with the resurrected Jesus on this day that we call Easter Sunday. Now, he could have used numerous stories from any of the hundreds of people who saw the resurrected Jesus, but he focuses most of his time on this story on the Emmaus Road. This is how it begins. It says, the same day, two of Jesus' followers were walking in the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. So these two friends were walking along the Emmaus Road. It's just after Jesus has died. And that morning, they've heard that Jesus' tomb was empty. And they've assumed that somebody must have stolen the body. They're confused. They're disappointed, devastated. And like so many others, they had pinned their hopes on Jesus to deliver the Jewish people from Roman oppression. They had seen him do miracles. They were amazed at his teachings. But then he died at the hands of the very people that had oppressed them for decades. And now his body is missing from the tomb. Why would somebody steal his body? You see, in their bleak state, that's their conclusion. Something else has gone wrong. It's easy, isn't it, to look at some circumstance in front of you and make the wrong conclusion. So you and I face times when we are disappointed because things haven't worked out the way we hoped that they would. And we face times when we want to cling to hope and we want the story of Easter to be true because, well, we've had a run of bad luck. But often despair is all that we can see, just like these two on this road to Emmaus. In the same way, when we discuss death, we want to believe that there is something else. But truth be known, we aren't just full of disappointments, we're also full of doubts. Now, you might never express your doubts out loud because of the unspoken rules that people have about what we can and we can't say in certain places. But you want to believe in the resurrection, but deep down you're wondering whether this whole thing is really true because it seems too good to be true. You see, disappointment and doubt of what these two are feeling as they walk along this Emmaus road. And as they walk, they talk to each other about all these confusing things that they're hearing. That they're trying to work out why Jesus died and why his tomb is empty. And they're just trying to make sense of it all. You see, this is one of the reasons I love the Bible. It is so true to real life. You see, earlier in his gospel, Luke actually says that he wrote his account about Jesus because he wants us to know for sure. To use Luke's language, he says, I decided to write an orderly account so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. You see, Luke knows that you and I have doubts at times. So he tells us the story of Jesus in a way that helps us amidst our own disappointments and doubts. He's honest about the way so many of us feel, the genuine questions that seem to percolate in our minds. It's one of the reasons I have such confidence in these gospel accounts, because if you're trying to make up a story, you wouldn't include stories of leaders like denying Jesus or people full of doubt and confusion, because it doesn't really help your cause. But it's there because this is the real deal. Now, as these two talked and discussed on the Emmaus Road, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But Luke says, but God kept them from recognizing him. So Jesus strolls along with these two on the Emmaus Road, and somehow they don't recognize that it's Jesus. Perhaps they didn't recognize him because they didn't expect it to be Jesus. Remember, they're not expecting a resurrection. Or perhaps they're distracted. If you've been in extreme tragedy before, you'll know that things just seem to go a little blurry or fuzzy in moments like this. It's hard to think straight. In addition to all this, though, Luke tells us here that God kept them from recognizing Jesus. Now, this makes me wonder, is it possible that we can actually miss seeing the presence of God amidst the difficulties that you and I face? I mean, has that happened to you? Perhaps it's happening right now, but that's another message for another day. You see, Luke continues here. He says, Jesus asked them, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along? That they stopped short, sadness written across their faces, Luke says. I mean, what a stunning portrayal to help us imagine the scene. Sadness written across their faces. Remember, this is Easter Sunday. I mean, where's the singing? Where's the joy? But then one of them, Cleopas, says, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard of the things that have happened there in the last few days. What you don't know about Jesus? You don't know what happened to him? Everyone in Jerusalem knows. How can you not know? Of course, the irony here is that it's these two who don't know what's happened to Jesus, and that Jesus is there right beside them. So Jesus says, well, tell me more. And then Cleopas just lays it all out. He says, well, the things that happened to Jesus. This man, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all of this took place. In addition, some of the women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning and they didn't find his body. And they came and told us that they've seen an angel, a vision of angels, and these angels said that he was alive. And some of our companions went to the tomb and they found it just as the woman has said. But they didn't see Jesus. So see, it just all bursts out. His confusion, his disillusionment, his shrinking faith, his anger. He's trying to make sense of it all. And his bottom line argument is this: we expected a different ending. And what we got is it's the death of the one we thought was going to save us, but now he's dead. And now someone must have stolen his body from the tomb, because really, what else could have happened? It's easy to see the circumstances in ways completely different to the reality. It's possible, isn't it, to see a full stop when it may well be the beginning of something new. Not uncommon to discern something solely as grim and bad, but it may actually turn out to be life-giving. So often the voices around us are often to blame. All they see is the end of the story, that things haven't worked out like we expected. It's all grim. Words of despair. And Luke tells us that Jesus begins to unpack the stories of the Bible and how all of these stories ultimately pointed to the hope in this one called Jesus. He goes right through the Old Testament and he highlights story after story. The stories are so often people stay away from because they think they're irrelevant, but Jesus explains their relevance. And he spends the day teaching and dialoguing and lingering. And he pulls together all these various threads of these stories to show how all of these pointed to the coming of Jesus and to hope to everyone who looks to him. And the more Jesus opened the scriptures, the more their pulses began to race. Luke says, by the time that they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey, Jesus acted as if he was going on, but they begged him, hey, just stay another night. Stay another night with us since it's getting late. And so he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it, and then he broke it and he gave the bread to them. And suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And Luke says, at that moment, Jesus disappeared. See, normally the host would actually be the one to break the bread, but here Jesus takes the bread. He takes the lead. And as Jesus breaks the bread, it's at that very moment that around the table, the eyes of these two on the Emmaus road are opened. And suddenly they realize they're dining with the resurrected Jesus. There's this beautiful painting here from the famous painter Caravaggio. And it captures a scene in a painting called Supper at Emmaus. Now, actually, he produced two different paintings by the same name. This is his later one in 1606. It's subtler than the first painting, but have a look at it. It's more intense, isn't it? But it's at the same time. Jesus sits in the middle with his two friends on either side. And there's bread on the tablecloth in front of him as Jesus dines with these two disciples. His eyes are closed in prayer as he raises his hand to bless the bread that he's about to break. And suddenly the two realize that this is Jesus. Do you notice the disciple on the left with his back who's leaning forward? He's hanging onto Jesus' every word. And the disciple on the right is gripping the edges of the table with both hands, gazing at Jesus with that burning intensity. His right hand moves forward, almost touching the hand of Jesus. And it's at this moment, everything just like clicks for these two. They see Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And at that moment, Luke tells us that Jesus disappeared. Apparently, he would go on to appear to hundreds of others. In fact, in one event alone, he appeared to 500 people. And I love the way these two disciples respond to what just happened. It says, they said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us?" You see, when scholars unpack this phrase, we're not our hearts burning within us. They say it speaks of this uncontrollable desire for someone, and that the heart is a reference to the whole person. In other words, these two on the road to Emmaus were saying that they had this life-changing personal encounter with Jesus. They felt their hearts, their whole lives going out to Jesus. They felt a love that they had never experienced before. And when did they feel it? Well, they felt it when the scriptures were being opened to them in a way they could understand it, in a way that pointed to who Jesus was and is. See, the reason Luke tells us this story is because he wants this to be our experience. He wants our hearts to burn within us. He wants us to have this life-changing personal encounter with Jesus, and not just once, but again and again and again. See, Luke understands that there are times when faith falters, when the whole story of salvation seems improbable, if not impossible. When we still want to believe in Jesus, but sometimes we just find it hard to know for sure. But he tells this story because he wants us to respond. See, some of you listening today have never responded to Jesus in a personal way. I can imagine Luke asking, what is it that stops you from making this your moment when you talk to Jesus and begin a relationship with him? Perhaps for some time you felt disillusioned with the treadmill that you're on because like deep down you realize you're placing your hope in something that's ultimately going to disappoint you. Like Steve Jobs, you really want to believe that there's something more than just this life, than just living and working and dying, but this can't be plausible, can it? It seems to go against the laws of science that show us that, well, death is the end of the story. It's the full stop. It's all impossible. But you see, sometimes what we think is impossible is actually possible. Let me illustrate it this way, and I've used this illustration at Grace City before because I find it really helpful. Can a triangle ever be a circle? Well, you say, well, of course not. A triangle has straight lines, has corners. It can't be a circle. It's completely impossible. But you see, what's impossible with two dimensions becomes very possible when you add a new dimension, a third dimension. So here's a normal orange cone. Now, this one's a bit well used around traffic sites, but effectively, an orange cone is a triangle made up of a whole bunch of circles. So forget the square, but just think about the series of circles that make this up when you think about another dimension. See, what seems impossible in two dimensions becomes really possible when you add another dimension in. And friends, that's exactly the reality of the resurrection, what the resurrection does for you and me. It radically changes the way we see any challenges and predicaments, even death itself. That death no longer has the last word, but the resurrection opens up our eyes to a new reality, a new dimension. See, the story of Easter is the story of something breaking into our world from outside our world, showing us that this world is not all that there is. And Easter Sunday, it's like it pulls back the curtain of our natural existence, and it shows us that there is some kind of power or force beyond our world, which is able to overturn the laws of nature and bring a dead man back to life. See, none of this Easter event fits nicely into the categories of how nature and science normally work, those dimensions. But this is precisely the point. The resurrection of Jesus overturns our definitions of what's possible and normal, and it defines a whole new reality. See, Luke, the writer of this Gospel of Luke, wants us to grasp that the events of the Easter story really happened. And what the Easter story shows us is that there's something beyond our world is actually a someone. That something that exists out there is not this impersonal force or a power or some subjective consciousness, not a great eternal abyss, but a someone, a personal God, a real being. And the really stunning thing about the Easter story is it shows us how, because of his love for us, God has dramatically intervened in our world. He's actually stepped into our world in real space-time history, and he became one of us, Jesus of Nazareth. That Jesus is God in human form, God who lived on this earth and died a human death and rose from the dead. And it's not just something out there beyond this life. It's that something is God who is out there, has drawn near to us and become one of us in the person of Jesus. And that's a lot to take in. But this is the Easter story. The story of a God who became human, lived, died, and rose again, and is able to change lives today. You see, Easter shows us that what actually looked like the end is actually the beginning that changes everything. And it's this event of the resurrection that birthed a whole movement called the church. It led to the multiplication and growth of the church. Remember, none of these early disciples were expecting a resurrection. They thought the events of Good Friday were a full stop, end of story. But when these same disciples saw the resurrected Jesus, they poured out into the streets of Jerusalem. And they declared, it's Jesus who you crucified right outside these walls. But we've seen him. He's risen from the dead. We've seen the resurrected Jesus right outside these walls. We're eyewitnesses to him. Jesus has indeed risen, they said. We've seen him with our own eyes. And suddenly the streets of Jerusalem were turned on their head. And ultimately the whole Roman Empire came to endorse Christianity, all because of the event of the resurrection. You see, people today continue to declare the difference that the resurrected Jesus makes in their lives. People who were addicted said, well, I met Jesus and he gave me power. People who are alone said, I met Jesus and I found a place to belong. People who were weighed down with all sorts of burdens said, I met Jesus and I've experienced freedom. See, that's why on this day people will gather from every continent, every culture, rich, poor, young, old, well-educated, illiterate, beaten, broken, arrogant, afraid. They all come to celebrate the Easter story because they have their own stories to tell of how Jesus has changed their life, my life. See, Luke is sharing the story with us because he wants that to be your experience too. He knows full well that there are moments when we are disappointed that things haven't turned out the way like we expected them to turn out. He knows that we have doubts whether our guilt and shame can actually be dealt with, or we become confused as to whether death is really not the end. Luke wants you to have the confident hope in the resurrection of Jesus. He wants our hearts to burn within us as we give ourselves over to Jesus. And so there's a question. What stops you from making this your moment when you begin a relationship with Jesus? In fact, why don't we pause right now? And let me lead us in a prayer because we believe Jesus is alive and able to help us. He loves to converse with us. So in this prayer, I'm going to use me and I through the prayer to enable this to be your own personal prayer to Jesus. He wants to hear from you today. Let me lead us in a prayer. Jesus, thank you that when I talk to you, I'm talking to a real being who lived and died and rose again. Thank you that you're showing me that there is more to this life, a tangible physical reality beyond this life. Thank you that there is more to life in the here and now, more than just living and working and dying. Jesus, I want to step into a vibrant relationship with you. I believe you lived, died, and rose again. And I want you to be the center of my life. Jesus, thank you for the hope that I can now have because of your death and resurrection. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, if you prayed that prayer for the first time today, we would love to hear from you. We have some getting started packs that we would love to send to you, or you can just let one of the hosts know in the chat space. After all, this is never the end. It's actually the beginning of your story. As we come to the end of this talk, I want you to notice one other response. So not only do they personally respond, but they just can't contain the joy that they experience in this moment. They have let others, they want to let others know. So Luke tells us in verse 33, within the hour, they went back on their way to Jerusalem. See, they take that 11-kilometer walk back to Jerusalem. There's no doubt it's in the dark, but they can't wait till the next day because all the others needed to know. See, at this moment, their sadness was replaced with joy. Their disappointment is replaced with excitement. And they rush out and they tell everyone that they have seen the resurrected Jesus. You see, their hearts have been strangely warmed. The fire that burned within them as the truth dawned on them, that they want other people to know this. And so these two flaming disciples kind of spark all the way back down this Emmaus road back to Jerusalem. And then they found the 11 disciples, Luke tells us, and the others who had gathered with them who said, well, the Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter. Apparently, Jesus has been appearing to other people, not just these two on the Emmaus road. And then these two start to talk about what they've experienced as well. And they say how they recognize Jesus over the breaking of the bread. So the idea is that you just can't keep this story to yourself. The whole world needs to know when you have encountered Jesus. See, all of us know that things aren't right in our world. But the good news of Jesus and the good news of the resurrection, it speaks hope. And it sparks life to our broken lives, to our broken neighborhoods, to our broken world. That Jesus is able to make all things new. So see, this is the good news of the gospel that can change everything. It changes the way we see life. It changes the way we see death. Easter Sunday says to us, what looks like the end is actually the beginning that changes everything. So you and I are on our own Emmaus road, and it's so easy to get distracted by what's going on around us that we don't always recognize Jesus is walking right with us. Sometimes we need to hear the voice of Jesus, not our own voice. And so we have something special prepared for you today. In the chat, there's a link that you can click on, and there is a word that you can choose that best describes how you're feeling right now. And when you do that, we will send you a letter that contains the truth that Jesus would want you to hear today. Now, if none of the words we've suggested describes you, just add your own word and we'll get a letter to you too. After all, we can be so distracted by what's going on all around us that we need to hear the voice of Jesus, not our own voice. So what might change for you in your circumstances if you knew 100% that Jesus is with you right now and that Jesus is making all things new? See, friends, let's make this Easter the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, because what looks like the end is actually the beginning that changes everything.